I never thought I'd be the guy writing one of these, but here I am. My name's Matt. I'm 37, and my wife, Sarah, and I have been married for 10 years. It started off like a fairy tale. College sweethearts, moved to New York, built our lives together. We had good jobs, a decent apartment in Queens, and life felt pretty damn perfect for the first few years. By year 6, we both felt ready to start a family. It seemed like the natural next step, right? We were financially stable, had a strong marriage, or so I thought, and I was ready to be a dad. Sarah seemed excited too, though maybe a little too relaxed about the whole process. But months turned into years, and nothing. No baby. At first, it was all hopeful. It'll happen when it happens. Just relax. The usual advice people give. We started tracking everything. Ovulation cycles, fertility windows, you name it. After a year of trying with no results, we went to see a doctor. We got tested, and both of us were told we were perfectly healthy. The doctors couldn't explain why we weren't getting pregnant. That's when the doubts started creeping in. Not because of the test results, but because of Sarah. Every time I'd bring it up, she'd brush it off. It's just stress, she'd say. You're working too much. I'm working too much. It'll happen when it's meant to. And for a while, I believed her. But deep down, I felt like something was off. So, fast forward to year 4 of trying. We're still not pregnant, and I'm getting more anxious about it. I mean, all the tests said we were fine. There was no medical reason why we couldn't have kids. Every time I brought it up, Sarah would have some smooth explanation. Maybe our timing is off, maybe it's your diet, or my personal favorite. These things just take time. But here's the thing. Something about her started to change. She wasn't as affectionate as she used to be. She'd come home later than usual from work, claiming she had extra meetings or late-night work dinners. It didn't raise a huge red flag at first because, well, she works in PR, and those events do happen. But the way she acted around me was different, like she was distracted or somewhere else, even when she was sitting right next to me. I brushed it off for a while, convincing myself it was all in my head. Maybe the stress of not having a baby was messing with both of us. But then, I found her phone one night. She left it on the kitchen counter when she went to take a shower. I don't usually check her phone. We had that kind of trust in our relationship, but something just didn't sit right with me that night. I picked it up and saw a text message from a guy named Nick. Now, I knew of Nick. He was someone she'd mentioned in passing, a big-shot real estate developer she'd worked with on a couple of projects. Seemed harmless enough at first. But when I opened the message, my heart dropped. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same place. It was followed by a wink emoji. My stomach twisted. This wasn't some business text. I scrolled through, and the more I read, the worse it got. There were dozens of messages going back months. Talk of meeting up, dinners at fancy restaurants, inside jokes, and things I didn't want to read. I felt sick. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those messages. Part of me wanted to throw the phone against the wall, but another part of me felt frozen. It was like the world had just shifted, and I couldn't quite process what I was looking at. When Sarah came out of the shower, she was humming some song like everything was normal. I must have looked like a ghost because she stopped mid-step, eyes locking on the phone in my hand. She didn't even have to ask what was going on. She knew. Who the hell is Nick? I asked, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. She hesitated for a second, just a second, before she launched into a rehearsed lie. Oh, Matt, it's not what you think, she started, reaching out to grab the phone from me. He's just a business contact. It's nothing, I swear. But I'd already read enough to know that wasn't true. I threw the phone on the table and said, "Don't treat me like an idiot, Sarah." I read everything. Meeting up in hotels? The dinners? This has been going on for months. She tried to backtrack, telling me it was harmless, that it was all just work stuff. But the more she talked, the more furious I got. My voice rose, and I cut her off. Don't stand there and lie to my face. We've been trying to have a baby for years, and you've been screwing around with this guy behind my back. That's when her face changed. The panic turned into something else, something colder. Matt, it wasn't about you. It never was. I needed, I don't know, something different. That was the moment I felt like the ground fell out from under me. I wasn't just angry. I was crushed. For 4 years, I'd been beating myself up, wondering why we couldn't get pregnant, thinking it was something wrong with us. And all along, she was lying to me. She didn't even deny it anymore. She just stood there, almost detached, like she was waiting for me to explode. And I did, but not in the way I expected. I just shut down. After the initial blow-up, I thought she'd confess. I was ready for her to admit everything and come clean. But Sarah, being Sarah, managed to twist the whole situation. She started crying, real tears, and told me that I was overreacting, that I didn't understand what kind of pressure she was under. "It's just stress, Matt," she sobbed. "We've been trying for so long, and it's taking a toll on me. I was just talking to Nick because he's been helping me deal with it. He's been through something similar in his own marriage." I didn't want to believe her, but she kept at it, making me feel like I was the one who was blowing everything out of proportion. "Nothing physical ever happened," she insisted. "I swear to you, Matt. It was just emotional. I was feeling lost, and he was someone I could talk to. I didn't want to be the guy who ruined his marriage over a bunch of texts, especially when she was making it sound like I wasn't being supportive enough. She said everything was falling apart because of the pressure to have a baby, that it was messing with her head. I just needed an escape," she said, her voice trembling. "I was so focused on trying to get pregnant, I lost myself." She was convincing, almost too convincing. I still had my doubts, but after hours of arguing, of her turning on the waterworks and swearing that Nick was just a friend she confided in, I found myself softening. She blamed the whole thing on the strain we were both feeling, telling me that it was the frustration of not being able to conceive that had driven her to this point. "Don't you get it?" she said. "We've been trying for 4 years, Matt. For long years. It's breaking me. I'm scared we're never going to have a baby, and I didn't know how to handle it. I swear nothing physical happened. I just needed someone to talk to." Somehow, despite all the warning signs, I let her reel me back in. She promised to cut off all contact with Nick and focus on our marriage, on our goal to have a child. She said if we could just get through this, we'd be stronger for it. She even threw herself into trying again, tracking her cycle, scheduling appointments with new specialists. And like an idiot, I believed her. I let the doubt simmer at the back of my mind, but I stayed. I wanted so badly for things to go back to how they used to be. We kept trying for a baby, and every time I brought up what happened, she'd shut it down, telling me to let it go. "It's just stress," she'd repeat, as if saying it enough times would make everything okay. After that last fight, things actually started to get better between us. Or at least, it seemed that way. Sarah became more attentive, more affectionate, like she was trying to prove that she was all in on the marriage. We went back to actively trying for a baby, doctor visits, ovulation kits, the whole 9 yards. For a few months, it felt like we'd somehow turned a corner. I'll admit, a part of me still had doubts, but every time those thoughts crept in, Sarah would reassure me. She cut off contact with Nick, or at least that's what she told me. She even gave me more access to her life, letting me see her phone, being transparent about her schedule. It was like she was trying to win back my trust. And for the most part, it worked. But then, there was this moment that I just can't shake. One afternoon, I was grabbing my jacket from the closet when I noticed Sarah's purse sitting on the floor, wide open. It's not like I make a habit of going through her things, but a small bottle had fallen out of her purse and caught my eye. At first, I thought it was aspirin or some over-the-counter medication. But when I picked it up, it didn't look like anything I'd seen before. The label was smudged, and I could only make out part of the name, something with a bunch of letters I didn't recognize. I shook the bottle. There were a few pills inside. My mind immediately jumped to the worst-case scenarios. Was she sick? Was there something she wasn't telling me? I debated asking her about it, but a voice in the back of my head told me to wait, to figure out exactly what these pills were before I jumped to conclusions. I slipped the bottle back in her purse, my heart pounding. The doubt that I had been pushing down for months was suddenly roaring back. Why would she be hiding medication from me? We were supposed to be working through this together. Everything was supposed to be getting better, but now this? I didn't ask her about it right away. I didn't know what to think yet. Maybe it was nothing. But then again, with everything that had happened, maybe it was something. I couldn't get those pills out of my head. Every time I looked at Sarah after that, I felt this gnawing unease in the pit of my stomach. I tried to act normal, but my mind was racing. What could she be hiding? Was it something to do with her health? Or was it connected to Nick? Or worse, to something else I hadn't even considered? I knew I had to find out what those pills were. So, when Sarah left for work the next morning, I quickly grabbed her purse, and snapped a picture of the bottle. The label was smudged, barely readable, but I figured I could show it to a pharmacist and maybe they'd be able to tell me what it was. Later that day, I went to a nearby pharmacy, feeling like some kind of detective. I pulled out my phone and showed the blurry picture of the bottle to the pharmacist, hoping for an easy answer. She squinted at it, tried to make out the letters, but after a minute or two, she just shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said, "but the label's too blurry. I can't make out what it says. Do you have the actual pill with you?" That threw me. I hadn't planned on taking one of the pills with me. I didn't want Sarah to notice anything missing. But now that the pharmacist couldn't help me, I realized I'd have to go back and grab one if I wanted answers. My mind was spinning. If the label was so worn that no one could read it, why was Sarah still carrying the bottle around? How long had she had those pills? And why the secrecy? I thanked the pharmacist and left, deciding I'd have to be more careful than ever. If I was going to figure this out, I needed to do it without tipping Sarah off. This was turning into a rabbit hole I hadn't expected to fall into. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. So that night, after Sarah went to bed, I went back to her purse, carefully opened the pill bottle, and took out one of the pills. I figured I'd head back to the pharmacy in the morning, get this mystery solved once and for all. Maybe it was something harmless, maybe it wasn't, but I needed to know. The next morning, as I was getting ready to leave, Sarah was getting dressed, moving around the house like it was any other day. But just as I was about to grab my keys and head out, she suddenly stopped, her eyes darting toward her purse. I froze. She opened the bag, and I saw her count the pills. Her face changed instantly. She turned to me, eyes wide with concern, maybe even panic. "Matt," she said, voice sharp, "did you take one of my pills?" I felt my heart rate spike. For a second, I thought about lying, but I didn't want to dig myself deeper into this mess. "Yeah, I took one," I said, trying to sound casual. "I had a toothache last night, and I didn't want to bother you." Sarah stared at me, her face turning from concern to something more like disbelief. "A toothache," she repeated. "Matt, those are just painkillers. Why wouldn't you ask me? I would have given you one." Her voice rose, a little too sharply. I could hear the frustration behind her words. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Painkillers? That's it? Maybe I really was overreacting. But then something about her reaction didn't sit right. Why was she so worked up over one missing pill? Why the need for this much intensity if it was just painkillers? It wasn't adding up. I stood there, nodding, but my mind was already racing again. "Sorry," I muttered, feeling a mix of confusion and guilt. I didn't think it was a big deal. Sarah gave me a look, still on edge. "Next time, just ask, okay?" I nodded again, but I could feel the doubt creeping back in, stronger this time. Why was she acting like this? A minute ago, I was ready to shrug this whole thing off as nothing, but now, her reaction, her panic, only made me more suspicious. I didn't say anything else. I just apologized again, grabbed my keys, and left. But as soon as I got in the car, I knew I had to take that pill to the pharmacy. Whatever was going on, it wasn't as simple as she wanted me to believe. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out exactly what. I was halfway to the pharmacy when my phone rang. It was Sarah. I almost didn't answer. I was too focused on what I was about to uncover. But something in me said to pick up, and when I did, the first thing I heard was panic in her voice. "Matt, I'm at the hospital," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Can you come here? I need you." My heart sank. A million thoughts started racing through my mind. Was it a nervous breakdown? The stress of everything finally getting to her? Maybe it was the argument we had that morning. Or worse, maybe she had lost a baby, if there even was one. I felt my stomach twist with guilt. Had I pushed her too far? I hadn't even considered the possibility that she could be pregnant, but now the idea hit me like a freight train. She could be carrying our child, and I'd been too focused on uncovering her lies to even notice. I turned the car around, my mind going 100 miles an hour. What if something had happened to the baby? What if the stress of trying for so long finally caught up with her? Was that what those pills were for? I didn't know what to think. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel the whole way to the hospital. When I got there, I rushed through the doors, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to expect. Bad news, maybe another fight. But when I saw her sitting on the hospital bed, looking dazed and a little pale, a nurse standing beside her. Everything stopped. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't from guilt or fear. They were from joy. "Matt, it happened," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm pregnant." I felt my entire world tilt, and then snap into focus. The panic, the fear, the doubts, all of it faded away in that moment. She was pregnant. After 4 long years of trying, it had finally happened. I stood there, staring at her, completely overwhelmed by the news. I rushed to her side, took her hand, and kissed her forehead, unable to contain the flood of emotions. I was on cloud nine. Whatever the pills were, whatever doubts I had, none of that mattered anymore. This was what we had been waiting for. The joy of finding out Sarah was pregnant left me floating for the rest of the day. We held hands, and I couldn't stop smiling. The nurses congratulated us. And for the first time in what felt like forever, everything seemed right. But even with the happiness, there was a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind that I couldn't ignore. The pills. It had been eating at me since the moment I found them. Now that Sarah was pregnant, I thought maybe I could just let it go. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. But after we got home from the hospital, while Sarah rested, I couldn't help myself. I needed to know. I had to close this chapter once and for all, so those doubts wouldn't haunt me through this pregnancy. I pulled the pill bottle from my pocket where I'd stashed it that morning, took out a single pill, and headed back to the pharmacy. The whole time I drove, I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that whatever it was didn't matter anymore. She was pregnant now. Wasn't that all I needed to know? But deep down, I had to understand. When I showed the pill to the pharmacist, she glanced at it, then back at me with a raised eyebrow. "This is a birth control pill," she said plainly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. I felt the blood drain from my face. "A birth control pill?" I repeated, feeling like the ground had just opened beneath me. "Yes," she confirmed, nodding. "That's what it is." "You didn't know?" I stood there, speechless. Birth control. All this time, all those years of trying to get pregnant, all the doctors, the tests, the heartache, Sarah had been taking birth control pills behind my back. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She had lied. It wasn't stress. It wasn't bad timing. It wasn't anything like what she'd said. She never wanted to get pregnant. I felt like an idiot. How had I not seen this? How stupid had I been to believe her every time she brushed off my questions, every time she blamed it on stress? But now she was pregnant. So what had changed? Why had she suddenly stopped taking the pills? Was she finally ready, or was something else going on? My head was spinning with questions I couldn't answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answers. I drove back home in a daze, my mind flooded with confusion and betrayal. I couldn't confront her, not now. She was pregnant, our child, but I felt like I'd been living in a lie for years. Why had she hidden it all from me? If she wasn't ready to have a baby before, why hadn't she just told me? Why lie about it? String me along, and let me think something was wrong with us. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, but at the same time, I didn't want to hurt her now, not when she was carrying our child. I sat in the car outside our house for a long time, trying to figure out what to do next. I knew one thing for sure. I had a lot of questions, but how could I ask them without tearing everything apart? I came home that evening feeling hollow. Sarah was already asleep, her peaceful breathing filling the room. She looked so serene, resting like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just torn my world apart without even knowing it. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, feeling the weight of everything that had happened over the last few days. Birth control pills. All those years wasted, thinking something was wrong, thinking it was stress. She had lied to me, and now, with her being pregnant, I couldn't even confront her, not without risking even more chaos. I walked into the kitchen, needing to clear my head. I sat down, staring at the table, thinking about how to approach Sarah with questions without making her nervous, without turning this into yet another fight. But my thoughts kept spiraling. How could I ask her why she lied for so long? How could I bring up the birth control without accusing her of betraying me? I knew I had to tread carefully. The last thing I wanted was to make her anxious now that she was pregnant. As I sat there, lost in thought, Sarah's phone buzzed from across the room. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but something told me to check. I hesitated, then stood up, picked up her phone, and glanced at the screen. The message was from him. "Nick." My stomach tightened as I read the text. "I want to see you. We need to talk." I felt my blood run cold. I scrolled up and found the message just before his. It was from Sarah. "There's something I need to tell you." My heart stopped. She had been planning to tell him something. What? It couldn't be. Not now. Not after everything we'd been through. I suddenly realized that nothing had changed. She hadn't cut him off. She was still seeing him, sleeping with him. While we'd been trying to fix our marriage, while she was pregnant with our child, she had been with him too. It felt like a punch to the gut. All those late nights, the excuses, the reassurances, it had all been a lie. She was living a double life, and I had been too blinded by hope to see it. But I didn't react, not this time. I didn't want to wake her, didn't want to storm into the bedroom and demand answers. I was too tired of the constant fighting, the endless questions. I needed to know the full story before I confronted her. I needed to see what would unfold. So I put her phone back on the table and sat down, deciding to wait. Wait for her to tell him whatever she needed to say. Maybe then everything would reveal itself. I was done with the constant emotional whiplash. I needed the truth, once and for all. But this time, I was going to let her show me who she really was without forcing it. All I could do now was wait for the pieces to fall into place. The next morning, Sarah woke up like nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek as she got dressed, smiling like everything was perfect in our little world. "I gotta run, babe. Early meeting today," she said, grabbing her bag. I watched her rush out the door, my stomach in knots, knowing exactly where she'd really been last night, and where she'd probably be tonight. All day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to come crashing down. The messages from Nick, the lies, the birth control pills, everything was swirling in my head, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I waited all day, anxious for what the evening would bring, knowing she wasn't going to come home on time. And sure enough, Sarah didn't disappoint. She came home late, much later than usual, her hair slightly messy, a look of mild guilt on her face. "I saw a colleague from work tonight," she said almost too casually. "You remember the one you suspected me of being involved with? I thought I should tell you now, just so there are no secrets between us." Her words hit me like a slap. I couldn't believe she was saying this, voluntarily, as if she was suddenly being honest after all the lies. Something was definitely wrong here. This wasn't the Sarah I knew. Why would she bring this up out of the blue, unless she was trying to cover something? I acted surprised, keeping my face as neutral as possible. "Really? You just ran into him?" I asked, feigning interest. She nodded, almost too eagerly. "Yeah, I figured I should be upfront with you. I don't want there to be any secrets between us anymore." I could barely keep the anger from bubbling up. The nerve of her, sitting here, pretending to come clean while I knew she was still meeting Nick behind my back. Something about this sudden confession felt like a test, like she was gauging how much I knew. I played along, acting like I appreciated her honesty, but inside, I knew I had to get to the bottom of this, once and for all. That night, after Sarah went to bed, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I grabbed her phone, heart pounding, and opened her messages with Nick. The conversation was still there, like a slap in the face. My hands trembled as I typed out a message to him, pretending to be Sarah. "Good night, Nick." I sat there, waiting, my heart racing in the silence of the dark house. A minute passed, then two. I was about to give up when his reply came through. "Good night, babe. I miss you already. Can't wait to see you again." My stomach dropped. It wasn't just an affair. It was still happening even now. After all the lies, after everything we'd been through, she was still seeing him and calling him babe. I stared at the message, my mind spinning. The betrayal felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I had my answer. Now I had to figure out what the hell to do next. The next morning, I woke up still reeling from what I had read the night before. Sarah was acting normal, going about her morning routine like nothing was wrong. I kept quiet, playing along like I didn't know a thing, but inside I was boiling over. I needed to know the truth, and today I wasn't going to let her twist her way out of it. She went into the bathroom and locked the door, her phone clutched in her hand. Something about the way she closed the door had me on edge. It wasn't her usual morning routine. I listened closely, my heart racing, and sure enough, I could hear her talking softly on the phone. It didn't take long to realize she was talking to him. I moved closer to the bathroom door, careful not to make a sound. Her voice was muffled, but I could make out just enough. I'm pregnant. It's yours. My entire body froze. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my vision blurring as the words sank in. It's yours. She wasn't talking about me. She was talking to Nick. All those moments of joy I'd felt about finally becoming a father. It was all a lie. I wasn't the father. Nick was. My hands were shaking as I stood there, trying to keep it together. I felt the room closing in on me, suffocated by betrayal. Before I could process it fully, I heard a sudden scream from the bathroom. Without thinking, I rushed to the door, banging on it. Sarah? What happened? Are you okay? My voice was shaking with fear and anger, but I tried to mask it. After a few tense moments, she opened the door, her face pale. Nothing, she said quickly, brushing her hair out of her face. It's just my hormones. I've been all over the place lately. Sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm sad. She forced a smile, but I could see the panic in her eyes. I stared at her, barely able to hold myself together. I nodded slowly, trying to act like I believed her, but the words I had overheard were ringing in my ears. It's his baby. I knew what I had heard, and now I needed answers. Real ones, not more lies. Sarah, I said, my voice suddenly calm, we need to talk. For real this time. She looked at me, startled. About what? I took a deep breath, trying to keep the rage from exploding out of me. About the baby. I need to know the truth. Her face changed instantly, panic flashing across her features. She opened her mouth, but I wasn't going to let her wriggle out of this one. I know about Nick, I said, my voice firm. I know you're still seeing him, and I know the baby isn't mine. She froze. For a second, she didn't say anything, her eyes wide with shock. But then, as usual, she scrambled for excuses. Matt, no, it's not what you think. Nick and it was a mistake. I swear, the baby could be yours. We don't know for sure yet. Stop. My voice cut through her excuses. I heard you. I heard you tell him this morning that the baby is his. She stood there, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing like she didn't know what to say. But for once, I wasn't going to let her spin her way out of this. I had the truth now, and no amount of lies could cover it up. I had waited long enough for her to come clean. Now it was time to decide what the hell I was going to do next. Sarah stood there, cornered, knowing there was no more room for lies. Her face shifted from panic to something almost defeated, and finally, she let out a long breath. Okay, fine, she whispered, her voice trembling. I'll tell you the truth. I stared at her, feeling nothing but emptiness, waiting for her to drop the last piece of the bomb that had been slowly exploding in my life. I could barely stand to look at her, the woman I thought I loved, the woman I thought was carrying our child. I did have an affair with Nick, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It started, I don't even know when anymore. We met through work, and it just happened. She rubbed her temples, trying to find the words. I didn't plan for this. I never wanted to hurt you, Matt. But I'm pregnant, and the baby is his. I felt like my world collapsed in that moment, even though I had already known the truth. Hearing her admit it, saying it out loud, felt like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. But she wasn't done. When I told Nick about the baby, he left, she said, her voice cracking. He doesn't want anything to do with me now. He was never going to leave his wife. I was stupid to think he would. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't move me. Not anymore. I couldn't stand to look at her. All the lies, all the betrayal. I had been a fool for so long, believing her excuses, her manipulations. I had wasted years of my life, and now I couldn't bear the sight of her. You need to pack your things, I said, my voice cold, barely able to contain my anger. I want you out of my life. Sarah's eyes widened, shocked. Matt, no, please. I thought if I told you the truth, we could, I don't know, figure things out. We've been through so much together. I don't care what you thought. I cut her off. You lied to me for years. You made me believe that something was wrong with us, that we couldn't have a child, and all the while you were sneaking around with him. I'm done, Sarah. Pack your things and leave. For a moment, She stood there in stunned silence, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. But then something changed in her. The tears in her eyes dried up, and her face hardened. "Fine," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You want me gone? I'll go. But you know what, Matt? You're a fool. I never wanted this life. I wanted more. More money, more excitement. Nick promised me everything, and yeah, I chased it. You wouldn't understand. Always working your boring job, content with your ordinary life." Her words were like poison, but I just stood there numb. "You think I wanted to be stuck here with you?" she continued, her voice rising. "I wanted to live big, Matt. I wanted the lifestyle I deserved. Nick promised me that, and I went after it. But you were just in the way." Her true nature was spilling out now, and it was like watching a stranger. I realized that the woman I thought I loved, the woman I had spent years trying to build a life with, was nothing more than a shallow, greedy liar. "I can't believe you're doing this to me," she added bitterly. "But fine. I'll leave. I'll figure something out. I always do. But just know this. You'll always be the man who wasn't enough." I didn't say anything. I just watched as she stormed off to the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and started packing her things. I felt nothing but relief. Sarah was a liar, a cheater, and driven by greed, constantly chasing after someone who could give her the life she thought she deserved. But now she was left with nothing. Nick didn't want her, I didn't want her, and she had nowhere to turn. As she walked out the door, suitcase in hand, I stood there, watching her go. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. She was finally gone, and with her, all the lies, all the betrayal, and all the chaos. I didn't need her anymore. And honestly, she never really needed me either. She was always looking for something bigger, something better. But in the end, she was left with nothing but herself. And that, I realized, was exactly what she deserved. After Sarah left, the house was eerily quiet. I stood in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for some kind of emotion to hit me. Sadness, anger, relief. But there was nothing. Just silence. It was strange how fast everything had fallen apart. And yet, the weight of it all felt lighter now. She was gone. The lies were gone. It was over. I sat down at the kitchen table, where I had spent so many nights thinking, planning, hoping for a future that was never going to happen. Sarah had left me broken, but in her exit, I felt something I hadn't in years: clarity. She'd shown her true colors in that last argument. Her desperation for money, her obsession with a life of luxury, how little I had actually mattered to her. The woman I married had disappeared a long time ago, replaced by someone who was constantly looking for the next big thing. And now that Nick had bailed, she had no one. But the thing that hurt the most wasn't losing her. It was realizing how much of myself I'd sacrificed for someone who didn't care. I had spent years trying to build a family, trying to make us happy, and she was using me the whole time. I had been blind to it, too trusting, too willing to believe her excuses. And now, I had to live with the fact that none of it had been real. But at least I wasn't living in that lie anymore. I thought about the future, what my life would look like without her. Honestly, it felt strange, but also kind of promising. I'd been consumed by our marriage, by our endless attempts to start a family, but now, there was no more pretending. The next few days were rough. I kept replaying the last conversation we had, her words echoing in my head. How had I been so blind for so long? I thought about the day we started trying for a baby, how excited I'd been, and all the disappointment that followed. I thought about those damn birth control pills, the lies she spun to cover up the truth. It was all so clear now, but at the time, I had no idea. The worst part was the baby. Knowing she was pregnant with his child, that was a pain I didn't know how to process. It was like a knife to the heart every time I thought about it. That baby could have been ours, but instead, it was a symbol of everything she destroyed. I had to remind myself that the child didn't deserve my anger. It was innocent in all of this, just like I had been. But Sarah? She was toxic, and I couldn't have her in my life anymore. There was no saving her, no forgiving her. I didn't hear from her for a few days after she left, which surprised me. Maybe she had moved on quickly, like she always did, or maybe she was stuck trying to figure out her next move. Either way, I didn't care. I was done with her. I started focusing on myself, getting back into my routine, seeing friends, hitting the gym. Slowly but surely, I felt like I was piecing my life back together, one small step at a time. I still had a lot to process, but for the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by someone else's lies. I was free. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's absence became a strange kind of relief. At first, I half expected her to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness or trying to manipulate me into letting her stay. But she didn't. There were no desperate phone calls, no teary apologies, just silence. It took a while to adjust to the quiet, but eventually, I realized that silence was the best gift she could have left me with. No more deceit, no more feeling like I was never enough. I had my life back, even if it was a little lonelier than before. I started to focus on the things that really mattered. My own happiness, my friends, even work. It felt good to finally take care of myself after years of pouring everything into a marriage that was nothing more than a facade. People around me started to notice the change. My friends, who had seen me in the worst of times, commented on how much lighter I seemed. My family, who had quietly watched my marriage unravel, offered their support, but they also saw that I was beginning to heal. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. I was rebuilding, but there were still moments when the anger would bubble up, when I thought about the years I'd wasted, or the baby that was never going to be mine. There were sleepless nights when I'd replay Sarah's lies in my head, wondering how I could have been so blind. But those moments became fewer and further apart. Then, one day, I got a message. It was from Sarah. I stared at the screen, the name that used to mean so much now, just a reminder of all the pain. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the message. Curiosity got the best of me, and I opened it. "Hey Matt, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted to let you know that I'm leaving town. I thought maybe we could talk before I go. There's still a lot I want to explain." I sat there for a long time, staring at the message. There was a time when I would have jumped at the chance to hear her out, to get closure, to understand why she did what she did. But now I didn't need her explanations. I already knew who she was. And more importantly, I knew I didn't need her in my life anymore. I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the message and set my phone down. I wasn't going to let her pull me back into the darkness she had created. She could leave town, chase whatever she was looking for, but I wasn't going to be a part of it. I had my own life to live, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was truly mine. No more lies, no more manipulation. Just me, standing on my own 2 feet, ready to move forward. Sarah's chapter in my life was over. It was time for me to write a new one.